Imagine a single place that held humanity's greatest ideas: science, medicine, mathematics, philosophy, knowledge powerful enough to reshape civilization itself. Now imagine that place didn't disappear in a tragic accident. No single fire, no sudden catastrophe. No moment history could point to and say, that was the end. What if the Library of Alexandria wasn't destroyed, but erased? Tonight, we reopen one of the ancient world's most unsettling cold cases. Before we go deeper, please subscribe and stay with us. The story begins in the 3rd century BCE, in a city unlike any the ancient world had ever seen. A city built not merely as a port or a political capital, but as a monument to knowledge itself, Alexandria. Founded by Alexander the Great and transformed by his successors into the beating heart of human civilization, Alexandria was designed to be more than a symbol of power. Under Ptolemy I, who took control after Alexander's death, a radical vision emerged. A sanctuary where every book, every scroll, every piece of wisdom from every known corner of the world would be gathered under one roof. Around 283 BCE, and expanded massively under his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus, that vision took physical form. The great Library of Alexandria rose not just as a collection of texts, but as the first great research institution in history, the world's earliest prototype of a modern university, known as the Mouseion, the Temple of the Muses. Within its halls, philosophers debated the nature of existence and the universe. Astronomers charted the motions of the stars. Medical scholars dissected bodies in a quest to understand life and death. And mathematicians created theories that would guide science for thousands of years to come. Ancient writers spoke of hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Some gave figures of 400,000, others 700,000. But they all agreed on one thing. This was the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world had ever assembled. Ships entering Alexandria's harbour were searched by royal decree. Any books they carried were confiscated, copied and archived. The originals remained in the library. The copies were returned to their owners. In Alexandria, knowledge was not merely borrowed. It was claimed, catalogued and preserved. This magnet for knowledge drew the brightest minds of the ancient world. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy. Hipparchus laid down the foundations of trigonometry. Herophilus performed scientific dissections centuries ahead of anything Europe would attempt. Callimachus devised what is considered the first known library catalogue in human history. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun nearly 1800 years before Copernicus. The library functioned like the ancient world's internet, a knowledge engine, a vault of ideas so powerful that later rulers would come to fear it. What made it extraordinary was not only the brilliance stored within its walls, but the ambition behind it. The Ptolemies wanted Alexandria to control knowledge in the way other empires controlled armies and trade routes. Knowledge was power, and whoever held the library held the future. For centuries, that ambition worked. Alexandria became the intellectual crown of the Mediterranean world. But there was a darker side to that greatness. Because when a place becomes the center of the world's knowledge, it also becomes a target. Some feared the power it represented. Some envied it. Some saw it as a threat to religion, ideology, or political control. Some believed that knowledge this concentrated should never belong to one people or one empire. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria is not, as we often imagine, the story of one fire, one accident, or one tragic night. It is the story of centuries of conflict, ambition, fear, ideology, and power slowly eroding the greatest vault of human intellect ever built. As the story unfolds, the question only grows sharper. How did humanity lose its greatest treasure? Was it burned by chance or erased by design? This is where the mystery truly begins. The first great shadow over the Library of Alexandria falls in the year 48 BCE, during one of the most turbulent periods in Roman history. Julius Caesar, locked in a bitter civil war against his former ally Pompey, arrives in Egypt expecting refuge and support. Instead, he finds a kingdom tearing itself apart. Two royal siblings, Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra VII, are locked in a deadly struggle for the throne of Egypt. Caesar, rather than finding stability, becomes entangled in a political powder keg and soon finds himself trapped in Alexandria, pulled into a war he never meant to fight. As tensions escalate and Caesar's position in the city becomes precarious, he resorts to a drastic measure. To prevent the enemy fleet from surrounding and destroying his forces, he orders the burning of ships in Alexandria's harbour. Militarily, it is pure necessity, a tactical decision made in the chaos of battle. But fire is never predictable. Ancient writers describe what followed. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE, tells us that the flames spread from the docks into the city itself. Cassius Dio echoes this, noting that warehouses that stored scrolls caught fire. The philosopher Seneca goes further, claiming that 40,000 books were burned that night. Yet here, the mystery deepens. None of these sources clearly say that the great library itself burned. They describe books and warehouses, but they do not state explicitly that the main library complex was consumed. Modern historians are divided because the geography of ancient Alexandria matters. The Great Library was located in the Mouseion district, at some distance from the harbour. For the fire to have reached it, flames would have had to leap across several neighbourhoods. So what exactly burned? The evidence points not to the heart of the library, but to dockside storage depots, places where scrolls seized from visiting ships were temporarily stored. These were the staging grounds where confiscated texts waited to be catalogued and copied. Many of those scrolls would have been duplicates, or works that had not yet been fully integrated into the central collection. Did Caesar, then, destroy the library? Some historians argue that he did, believing that the fire spread unpredictably through the city and may have damaged parts of the library's buildings or sections of its collection. Others, however, insist that he did not. Among them is Mustafa el-Abadi, one of the foremost scholars of Alexandria, who argues strongly that the main library survived this episode. Archaeological analysis and geographic reconstructions support his view. The library complex lay far from the docks. No ancient source directly states that the library burned. And the Serapeum, the daughter library associated with the Great Library, continued to function in later centuries. The picture that emerges is that Caesar's fire did not completely destroy the Great Library, but it did inflict a serious wound. Thousands of scrolls, taken from ships sailing from Greece, Persia, India, Phoenicia, and other lands, were lost. The damage represented not just Egyptian or Greek culture, but material drawn from far beyond Egypt's borders. It was a massive cultural injury. Yet the core of the library appears to have survived. It continued, but weakened, limping forward after the fire. This moment, however, marks something crucial, the beginning of the library's long, multi-century decline. It was not total destruction, not yet. But it was a crack in the foundation, a sign that even the greatest sanctuary of knowledge could be touched, damaged, and diminished. What Caesar began, whether intentionally or not, would be made worse by the centuries that followed. And the next great assault would strike at another key pillar of Alexandria's intellectual world. If Caesar's fire was the first fracture in Alexandria's intellectual fortress, the second great blow would come 4 centuries later from a force even more relentless than war: ideology. The year is 391 CE, and the Roman Empire has changed, not only politically, but spiritually. Christianity, once a persecuted minority faith, has risen to become the official religion of the empire under Emperor Theodosius I. With that transformation comes a surge of religious tension that will reshape the fabric of the ancient world. In Alexandria, these tensions focus on a towering sacred complex, the Serapeum. This was not the main library, but it was deeply connected to it, a daughter institution built on a hill overlooking the city. Ancient accounts describe the Serapeum as magnificent, filled with statues, lecture halls, courtyards, ritual chambers, and spaces for learning. Over time, several sources suggest that thousands of scrolls from the Great Library had been stored or relocated here, making the Serapeum perhaps the last great sanctuary of Alexandrian knowledge. But in 391 CE, conflict explodes. Clashes break out between Alexandria's pagan community and the rising Christian authorities. When violence escalates, the city's powerful bishop, Theophilus, backed by imperial decree, moves decisively against pagan temples. At the top of his list stands the Serapeum. The Christian historian Orosius writes of Christian crowds storming the complex. Other accounts tell of statues smashed with hammers, mosaics ripped from walls, altars torn down, and sacred objects destroyed or burned in the streets. The Serapeum, once a temple of learning and a beacon of knowledge, is systematically dismantled. What happened to the scrolls that may have been stored there is the subject of continuing debate. Some historians argue that by the time of this attack, the Serapeum's collections had already been diminished by earlier wars and simple decay. Others believe that large numbers of scrolls still remained, including works that had been salvaged from earlier disasters. Archaeological excavations in the 20th century uncovered fragments of papyrus, writing tablets, architectural remains consistent with lecture halls, and areas that appear to have functioned as storage rooms. None of these remains are intact enough to confirm the full scale of the library that once existed there, but they suggest a place where texts and teaching were central. Whatever the exact size of its collection at the time, the destruction of the Serapeum marks a turning point. It represents the end of open pagan scholarship in Alexandria, the curtailment of scientific research and philosophical debate associated with the old religious and intellectual traditions, and perhaps the loss of one of the last large storehouses of Alexandrian scrolls. This was not an accident. It was an act of ideological domination, in which one worldview replaced another, and, in the process, may have erased centuries of knowledge. The fall of the Serapeum was a deliberate dismantling of a community, a culture, and possibly the last major repository of the great library's surviving works. To this day, historians ask the same questions. Was this the moment when the library, in spirit if not in name, truly died? Or did remnants of its collections linger in hidden corners of Alexandria, surviving just long enough for the next wave of destruction to finish what had begun long before? If Caesar's fire can be read as largely accidental and the destruction of the Serapeum as driven by religious ideology, another devastating blow to Alexandria's world of knowledge came from something more brutally chaotic: civil war. The year is 272 CE, and the Roman Empire is unraveling. Rival emperors, economic crisis, invading armies, and internal rebellions have left the empire fractured. In the east, a powerful queen has risen, Zenobia of Palmyra. Her empire expands rapidly, taking control of Syria, Judea, and finally Egypt itself. Egypt is more than just another province. It is Rome's breadbasket. Whoever controls Egypt controls the empire's grain supply. Whoever controls Alexandria controls Egypt. That alone is enough to summon Rome's wrath. Emperor Aurelian, determined to restore unity and crush Zenobia's rebellion, launches a major campaign to retake Alexandria. What follows is not a distant battlefield clash, but brutal urban warfare. The fighting rages street by street, house by house, inside one of the ancient world's most densely populated cities. The surviving ancient sources are few, but they converge on one critical detail. Aurelian's forces set fire to large parts of the Mouseion district. The Mouseion was no ordinary neighborhood. It was the cultural and administrative heart of Alexandria, full of palaces, lecture halls, official buildings, and, according to many scholars, the original location of the Great Library. For this reason, many historians believe that one of the library's most devastating physical losses occurred during Aurelian's siege. This time, the destruction was not targeted at ideas, but at territory, the collateral damage of imperial reconquest. By 272 CE, it is possible that the original library building or its successor institution still stood, and that many scrolls had survived earlier fires. The fighting that consumed the Mouseion hit precisely the area most associated with the library, and after this period, no ancient author ever again mentions the Great Library as a functioning institution. That silence itself speaks volumes. Mostafa el-Abadi has described Aurelian's siege as perhaps the most overlooked destruction in Alexandria's history. Unlike Caesar's fire, which ancient writers describe in vivid detail, and unlike the Serapeum's fall, documented by church historians, Aurelian's campaign left behind only sparse and indirect references. The people who could have told the full story, the scholars, librarians, and scribes, lived and worked in the very district that burned. Their voices were likely silenced in the flames. Modern archaeology has begun to fill in some of the gaps. Excavations in the late 20th century uncovered evidence of collapsed structures, scorched stone, widespread burning, heavy damage consistent with weapons, and layers indicating intense urban conflict in the Mouseion area. These layers date close to the time of Aurelian's siege. For many researchers, this strongly suggests that whatever physical remnants of the library's buildings, collections, records, or archives remained by this time were heavily damaged or destroyed. If Caesar's fire wounded the library and the Serapeum's fall symbolized the end of its pagan scholarly tradition, Aurelian's siege may have struck at its physical heart, tearing apart the structures that housed its collections. The library's body, so to speak, may have been destroyed in these battles. And yet, even after this event, another story would arise centuries later. A story more dramatic than any of these. One that would become the most controversial claim ever made about the library's destruction. It is to that story that the investigation now turns. For centuries, a single story has overshadowed all others in popular explanations for the fall of the Library of Alexandria. It is a story that appears in countless textbooks, documentaries, and retellings. The claim that the library met its final and total destruction during the Arab conquest of Egypt in 642 CE, when the Muslim general Amr ibn al-As allegedly burned its books on the orders of Caliph Umar. In this legendary version, the Caliph is said to have declared that if the books in the library agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed, they were dangerous. According to the tale, the scrolls were then used as fuel in the city's public baths, heating the water for months. It is a vivid narrative, unforgettable and often repeated. But when measured against the historical record, it almost certainly collapses. The first problem is silence. No writer from the centuries immediately following the Arab conquest mentions such an event. No Muslim historian of the 7th or 8th centuries reports the burning of a great library in Alexandria. No Christian, Coptic, or Byzantine chronicler speaks of it. There is not a single surviving eyewitness account. The first sources to mention this story appear only in the 13th century, in the works of Ibn al-Kift and Bar Hebraeus, both writing more than 600 years after the supposed event and drawing on hearsay rather than primary documentation. Modern scholars examining this gap are nearly unanimous in concluding that the tale is a medieval invention. The second problem is chronological. By the time Amr ibn al-As entered Alexandria in 642 CE, the library that once dominated the intellectual world was already long gone. Caesar's fire in 48 BCE had destroyed thousands of scrolls. Aurelian's siege in 272 CE had devastated the Bruchian district where the library once stood. The Serapeum had been destroyed in 391 CE during a religious purge. No ancient author refers to the Great Library after the 3rd century CE, and it is very likely that the site where the library had once stood had been abandoned or repurposed for centuries by the time of the Islamic conquest. There was no functioning institution left to burn, no scrolls, no librarians, no grand halls of learning. The timeline itself undermines the legend. The third problem lies in politics. The Middle Ages were a time of intense ideological conflict between Christian Europe and the Islamic world. Tales of opponents as destroyers of knowledge and civilization served as powerful propaganda. Historians now believe that the story of the Caliph ordering the library's destruction was created in this environment, as a way to cast a cultural and religious rival as hostile to learning. It spread during the era of the Crusades, took root in Western narratives, and survived well into the modern age, even as evidence increasingly failed to support it. Modern scholarship, including the work of figures such as Bernard Lewis, Dimitri Gutas, Mostafa El-Abadi, Jonathan Berkey, and George Atier, rejects the story of a Muslim-ordered destruction of the library. Muslim and Western historians alike have concluded that this dramatic tale is myth, not history. So what did happen in 642 CE? Historical records show that Amr ibn al-As took Alexandria after initial resistance, but then moved to preserve its institutions. Administration, scholars, and key structures of the city were largely kept intact. Contemporary accounts emphasize continuity rather than catastrophe. There is no record of mass book burnings or attacks on centers of knowledge. In fact, under early Islamic rule, Greek medical texts and scientific works were preserved and, in many cases, translated and transmitted. The early Islamic period became a bridge, not a barrier for knowledge, helping to preserve what might otherwise have vanished. This myth matters because it distracts us from the real story. The library did not fall because of a single dramatic act in 642 CE. Long before Amr rode into Alexandria, the library had already been dismantled by war, ideology, neglect, and time. The legend survives because it is simple and dramatic, but reality is more complex and, ultimately, more tragic. The library died centuries before that conquest, its fate sealed by a series of earlier blows. As we move forward, the question shifts. If no single event destroyed the library, if it did not simply vanish in one apocalyptic blaze, then what forces truly erased it from the world? The answer lies not only in fires and battles, but in quieter, more insidious enemies, forces that don't march with armies, but seep in slowly, unnoticed. For generations, historians searched for a single, defining moment, a night when flames tore across Alexandria's sky and the greatest library in human history disappeared in an instant. But what if that night never existed? What if the Library of Alexandria did not die in fire, but in silence? After the chaos of Caesar's campaign, after the devastation of Aurelian's siege, after the ideological purge that brought down the Serapeum, another, less dramatic force took hold. Neglect. Not a weapon, not a conquering army. A slow, quiet abandonment that destroys civilizations from within. One of the library's greatest vulnerabilities lay in the very material on which its knowledge was written. Its scrolls were made of papyrus, a fragile medium compared with modern paper. Papyrus has many enemies. Humidity can soften and rot it. Mold can grow silently in dark, damp rooms. Insects, including termites and beetles, thrive in Mediterranean climates and bore through fibers. Sudden changes in temperature can cause it to warp or crack. Water damage from leaks or flooding can stain and dissolve ink. Frequent handling wears down edges and surfaces. Time itself, even under ideal conditions, slowly weakens its fibers. Alexandria was a coastal city, constantly exposed to moisture carried inland from the sea. Flooding sometimes reached its lower districts. In such an environment, scrolls needed meticulous care. To protect them, the library required teams of scribes to copy and recopy aging scrolls, conservators to maintain storage spaces, copyists to reproduce texts before they decayed beyond use, rooms carefully managed for temperature and dryness, and, above all, continuous resources, funding, and political support. When any of those elements failed, when scribes were not hired, when repairs were postponed, when rooms were not kept dry, the materials of knowledge began to disintegrate. At the same time, the kingdom that had created and nurtured the library was itself in decline. By the 1st century BCE, Egypt was no longer the powerful, wealthy realm that had built the Mouseion and invested heavily in scholarship. Economic decline, military defeats, endemic corruption, and growing Roman interference undermined the stability that the library depended on. As funding shrank, support for scholars and copyists faltered. Scholars began to leave. Positions were not refilled. Buildings went unrepaired. The copying of texts, the most crucial act of preservation in the ancient world, slowed, then sometimes stopped. Knowledge, like a flame, must be tended. When it is not, it flickers and dies. When Rome finally annexed Egypt in 30 BCE, the library became a tiny part of an enormous empire. Rome's priorities centered on taxes, the military, trade routes, politics, and territorial expansion. The preservation of knowledge, while valued by a few, was rarely at the top of the imperial agenda. Some Roman emperors patronized scholarship in Alexandria, but many more ignored it or saw it merely as a luxury. Surviving documents from the Roman period suggest a gradual decline. Fewer scholars in residence, fewer public lectures, reduced staffing, a waning of scientific research, and cuts to funding for the museum. The library was not dramatically destroyed in these years. It was allowed to fade. Nature, too, played a part. Alexandria sits in a seismically active region, and over the centuries, earthquakes repeatedly struck the city and its environs. Modern underwater archaeological surveys, particularly those off Alexandria's coast, have revealed collapsed districts beneath the sea. Whole clusters of buildings submerged, massive temple pillars lying on the seafloor, broken statues buried in sediment. From the 3rd to the 8th centuries CE, several major earthquakes shook the region. One particularly devastating quake in 365 CE is known to have damaged large parts of the eastern Mediterranean, including Alexandria. If scrolls were still stored in stone chambers, underground rooms, or buildings near the royal quarter and the library's old district, such quakes could have caused ceilings and walls to collapse, crushing shelves and archives. Knowledge can be lost not only to flame, but to falling stone. There is another, subtler sign that the library's end was near: the disappearance of the librarians themselves. After the 3rd century CE, there is no record of any chief librarian in Alexandria, no names of major scholars associated with the Mouseion as an institution, no references to its leadership. The role itself seems to vanish from the historical record. A library without librarians is already, in a very real sense, dead. Taken together, these forces paint a picture of a slow death. The library did not vanish because of one catastrophe, but because of a chain reaction. War, ideology, neglect, decay, shifting politics, earthquakes, dwindling funds, the departure and death of scholars, and finally abandonment. Each event stripped away another layer of what had once been the greatest repository of knowledge on earth. Each generation lost a little more. At some point, there was no grand building left, no coherent collection, no staff, no institutional memory. Nothing for later conquerors even to recognize as the legendary library. By the time the medieval legends were born, there was nothing left to destroy. Only myths remained. Only echoes of a place where humanity had once tried to gather all knowledge and failed to protect it. Yet even as the library disappeared physically, its absence stirred new curiosity. The mystery of its loss inspired fresh research, new debates, and innovative methods of investigation. Some scholars began to argue that fragments of it survived, scattered in other centers of learning. Others suggested that its spirit lived on in the institutions that followed. A few went further, proposing that its destruction was not merely the product of circumstance, but of deliberate human choices. That curiosity and those questions opened a new chapter, the modern search for the truth. For nearly 17 centuries after the library faded from the historical record, the world lived with little more than legends, brief mentions, and scattered fragments. Then, in the 18th century, during Europe's Enlightenment, a new kind of curiosity stirred. It was driven not by conquest or ideology, but by a desire to understand what had truly happened to the greatest center of learning the ancient world had ever known. The first wave of this modern search began in the 1700s. Scholars such as Edward Gibbon in England, Barthold Niebuhr in Germany, and John Toland in Ireland gathered every ancient text they could find that mentioned the Library of Alexandria. They compared accounts, tried to reconstruct timelines, and examined contradictions. Their early conclusions were striking. No single ancient source described a final, decisive destruction. The accounts that did exist often contradicted one another. And taken together, the evidence suggested that the library had likely suffered multiple separate losses rather than one catastrophic end. These researchers were among the first to seriously challenge the myth of one fire and to reopen the mystery. In the 19th century, the rise of Egyptology transformed that curiosity into more systematic exploration. Napoleon's 1798 campaign in Egypt sparked an intense European fascination with the country's ancient past. French scholars, including Jean-François Champollion and Édouard de Villiers du Terrage, surveyed Alexandria's ruins and topography. They mapped the city and identified remnants of ancient structures. Their studies revealed architectural remains in the Mouseion district and indicated the presence of temple complexes and Greek administrative buildings. These findings supported the theory that the Great Library had once stood somewhere in that area, even if no single ruin could be clearly identified as the library itself. The geographic puzzle, however incomplete, began to form. The 20th century brought archaeology and technology into the search. From the 1920s to the 1950s, Egyptian and Greek archaeologists conducted excavations in and around Alexandria. They uncovered platforms that resembled lecture halls, structures that may have housed scholars, fragments of papyrus, chambers that looked like archives, and stone layers showing signs of burning from the era of Aurelian. These discoveries provided the first tangible evidence of a district dedicated to learning and administration. From the 1960s to the 1980s, Polish and Egyptian teams focused on the site traditionally associated with the Serapeum. They uncovered destroyed pillars, shattered statues, foundations that aligned with academic spaces, rooms that appeared suitable for storage, and layers of fine papyrus dust embedded in the earth. The picture that emerged confirmed that the Serapeum had indeed been both a temple and an intellectual center, supporting the idea that it had housed a significant collection of texts, perhaps linked to the greater library. In the 1990s, the search extended beneath the sea. French archaeologist Franck Goddiot led underwater excavations near Alexandria's modern harbour. His teams discovered submerged remains of the ancient royal quarter, colossal statues, massive granite blocks, columns, and the ruins of temples. These findings proved that parts of ancient Alexandria, including important government and religious buildings, now lay underwater. It became clear that any search for the library's remains had to include the seabed. Many scholars began to suspect that structural elements of the library or related buildings might lie buried beneath the waves. The 21st century added satellite technology and advanced analysis to the investigation. Between roughly 2004 and 2010, multinational teams from institutions such as Oxford University, the University of California, and Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities used ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging to study the regions associated with the Mouseion and the ancient royal quarter. Their findings suggested the presence of multiple large structures in the area, some of which appeared to have been destroyed by military action, likely Aurelian siege, and others that may have been damaged by earthquakes. This reinforced the theory that the library's destruction was multi-phased, involving both war and natural disaster. From about 2010 to 2020, attention turned to surviving papyri and fragments associated with Alexandria. Scientists and historians analyzed these materials using modern techniques. The patterns they found were telling: heavy water damage, extensive insect erosion, decay consistent with centuries of neglect, and burnt fragments that matched timelines of late Roman-era fires. The results suggested that scrolls and documents deteriorated over long periods, and that destructive events punctuated rather than solely caused the loss. The library's disappearance was a drawn-out process, not a single night of flames. By the 2020s, a broad academic consensus had emerged among historians and archaeologists from around the world, including researchers in the United States, Egypt, France, and Greece. They agreed on several key points. The library was not destroyed in a single fire. Julius Caesar's campaign caused partial but serious damage. Aurelian's siege was catastrophic for the library's district. The destruction of the Serapeum ended a major strand of Alexandrian scholarly tradition. Natural decay and environmental factors played a critical role, and by the time of the Islamic conquest, in 642 CE, there was no major library institution left to burn. The library, they concluded, had died slowly across centuries through layered events. Modern research matters because it strips away simplistic legends and reveals a more profound reality. The library was not killed by one villain, one empire, or one religion. It was undone by time, politics, war, natural disaster, and human neglect. That truth is more complex and more devastating than any one mythical blaze. It also paves the way for a more unsettling possibility, that beyond accident and misfortune, there may have been deeper motives that pushed the library toward extinction. For a long time, historians largely framed the Library of Alexandria's disappearance as the result of accidents, wars, and natural forces. A misplaced flame here, a siege there, an earthquake, a period of neglect. But in recent years, some scholars have begun asking a more disturbing question. What if the library did not merely fall, but was pushed, slowly, deliberately, across generations by people who feared what it contained? Knowledge is power, but too much knowledge can be threatening. The Library of Alexandria held more knowledge than any other single place on Earth in its time. That made it an irresistible asset, but also a dangerous one. The first motive modern researchers consider is political power. Throughout history, rulers have tried to control information. Within the library's shelves were scrolls on military strategy, geography, navigation, political systems, economic models, and detailed histories of rival empires. There were scientific theories that could challenge official religious or political narratives. To certain rulers, the library was not simply a treasure. It was a potential weapon that could be turned against them. Ptolemaic kings are known to have restricted access to certain scrolls. Some texts may have been kept for the eyes of rulers and their closest advisors alone. Later, Roman governors sometimes regarded Alexandria's intellectual culture as a threat. A city full of scholars was a city full of debate and criticism, a city where people might question imperial authority. In some Roman documents, Alexandria is portrayed as a place that thinks too much and obeys too little. It is not hard to imagine why Roman officials, wary of unrest, might have felt uneasy about a community of independent thinkers with access to global knowledge. The second motive is ideological control. The library held ideas that challenged religious traditions and belief systems. Within its collection were works that questioned the existence of the gods, texts that proposed heliocentric models of the universe, writings that speculated about other worlds, and medical and anatomical treatises that explained the human body and disease in ways that could undermine established religious doctrine. To religious authorities, whether pagan, Jewish, Christian, or later theological interpreters, such material could be seen as dangerous. The violent destruction of the Serapeum is a clear example of how ideology can turn on knowledge. In that episode, the temple's symbolic power, its association with pagan religion and scholarship, made it a target. Ideas, in such a context, can be more explosive than any fire. A third motive emerges from rivalry between cities and intellectual traditions. In the ancient world, cultural prestige translated into money, influence, and political leverage. Alexandria's supremacy as a center of learning was resented and challenged. Cities like Athens, Pergamon, Rome, and Antioch all wanted to claim the mantle of intellectual leadership. Pergamon, in particular, possessed a major library of its own in what is now Turkey. Its rulers accused Alexandria of aggressive tactics, stealing books, enticing or kidnapping scribes, and sabotaging supplies of writing materials. Alexandria returned the accusations. This was not a gentle rivalry. It was a war of ideas and reputations. In such a climate, the weakening or destruction of a rival's library would shift prestige and power back to competing centers. The fourth motive lies in internal politics. The Mouseion was not simply a school, it was effectively an intellectual arm of government. Scholars there advised kings, influenced foreign policy, wrote histories that shaped how the public viewed their rulers, and developed scientific models that could empower or undermine political decisions. A powerful library and a cohort of scholars with access to wide-ranging knowledge are political actors. For insecure rulers, that kind of independent influence is threatening. Some Ptolemaic kings responded by cutting funding to the library and the museum, by removing scholars from positions, and even by exiling philosophers who questioned their legitimacy. These actions look less like accidents and more like deliberate purges, aimed at curbing the power of knowledge and those who wielded it. Modern researchers point to a series of clues that, taken together, suggest not a single conspiracy, but a pattern of deliberate erosion. After the 3rd century, no chief librarian is named in any surviving text, as if the very office had been allowed to vanish. Some sources allude to rooms whose collections were emptied at particular moments of political transition. Records attest to scholars who were killed, forced out, or silenced during periods of political upheaval. The Mouseion district, the intellectual heart of Alexandria, was struck repeatedly in conflicts, more often than some other neighborhoods, as though it were a recurring battlefield. In the surviving corpus of ancient works, certain types of texts are conspicuously missing. Political histories that might have challenged later regimes, controversial scientific works that clashed with dominant beliefs, and more radical philosophical writings are disproportionately absent. Over time, intellectual gravity shifts to places like Antioch, Athens, and Constantinople. Alexandria's role as a vibrant center of global knowledge fades abruptly. None of these individual facts proves a coordinated plot, but when assembled, they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. A group of historians from Cambridge, Harvard, Copenhagen, and Alexandria University, among others, have proposed a chilling hypothesis. The library was weakened deliberately by political and ideological pressure over many centuries, so that when war, disaster, or decay struck, it was already too fragile to survive. It was not murdered in a single moment, but starved slowly. Its power was chipped away by 1,000 small decisions made by many different hands. The conclusion that emerges is subtle. There was no one mastermind, no singular villain behind the library's demise. Instead, many forces, with many motives, acted over time. Each war, each purge, each funding cut, each act of censorship, each neglectful decision pushed the library further toward extinction. Popular myths may crave a single dramatic executioner, but the reality is a system that, intentionally or not, made it almost impossible for the library to live. This leads to an even more painful question. If the library's destruction was the result of countless small choices, what exactly did those choices cost humanity? What knowledge vanished forever when those scrolls were burned, buried, or allowed to rot? The answer is almost unimaginable. For more than 2,000 years, thinkers have wondered what, exactly, the Library of Alexandria contained. What if we could see its shelves? What if we could read the books that no longer exist? Ancient writers left clues, quotations from lost works, references to titles, descriptions of treatises now gone. Modern scholars have tried to piece together the shape of that vanished collection. The picture that emerges is heartbreaking, because the library did not just preserve the past, it held possible futures. One of the greatest losses lies in science. The library was home to scientific theories so far ahead of their time that, had they survived in full, the scientific revolution might have arrived more than a millennium earlier. Among the most striking examples is the work of Aristarchus of Samos. Long before Copernicus, Aristarchus proposed that the Earth orbits the Sun, that the Earth rotates on its axis, and that the stars are unimaginably far away. We know these ideas only because later authors mention them. His original treatise has vanished. If that book had survived, humanity's understanding of the universe, and perhaps its journey into space, might have unfolded centuries sooner. The library's astronomical records were equally extraordinary. It contained star maps, planetary tables, astronomical instruments, and observational records gathered from Egypt, Greece, Babylonia, and India. The great astronomer Hipparchus compiled a star catalogue with hundreds of entries. Evidence suggests he may have discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the gradual shift in Earth's rotational axis. But his masterwork is gone. We are left with fragments and references, while the full depth of his data and methods remains beyond our reach. Geography was another area of brilliance. The library housed the work of Eratosthenes, who not only calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, but also created a map of the known world and compiled coordinates for thousands of locations. His measurements were within about 1% of the true value of Earth's size. Nearly 1,700 years later, Columbus sailed with flawed maps and underestimated the planet's circumference. Had Eratosthenes' complete map and data survived, the age of exploration might have unfolded differently, more accurately, perhaps more safely, and with fewer disastrous miscalculations. In medicine, the losses are equally immense. The library was home to Herophilus, the first known human anatomist. At a time when dissection was rarely practiced, he studied the human body directly, examining the nervous system, the brain, the eye, the circulatory system, and the reproductive organs. He wrote detailed treatises describing his techniques and findings. Every one of those medical works has been lost. What remains are scattered mentions of his discoveries. Without his books, medicine in later centuries had to rediscover much of what he already knew. It is likely that his writings could have advanced medical science by hundreds of years. The library also safeguarded literature and philosophy on an almost unimaginable scale. It held the complete works of Sophocles, of which only 7 plays survive today out of more than 100. It contained fuller versions of Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sappho, epics older than Homer, and histories of Persia, Carthage, India, and Ethiopia, written from perspectives that are now lost. There were dialogues by Aristotle and Plato beyond the ones we possess, and entire philosophical schools whose writings have vanished without a trace. Scholars at the museum and library catalogued hundreds of thousands of texts. Today, we possess only fragments of that vast tapestry. Even technology and engineering suffered from this erasure. The library stored treatises describing early steam-powered devices, complex water clocks, mechanical automata, early forms of robotics, optical experiments, and sophisticated engineering techniques. There were accounts of mathematical machines and devices that look, in hindsight, like prototypes of engines. Inventors such as Hero of Alexandria, Ctesibius, and Philo devised mechanisms that survive only partially in later descriptions. If the full technical manuals of such thinkers had survived intact, human industry and mechanics might have leapt forward dramatically. Some of the most haunting losses concern history itself. The library held records of civilizations whose own archives did not survive. There were texts about the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, early Persians, the Hittites, pre-classical Greek cultures, ancient African kingdoms, early Indian literature, and early Jewish and Near Eastern histories. Many of these works were never widely copied. They may have existed in only a few collections, with Alexandria among the most important. When the library died, these voices likely died with it. Entire peoples lost their chance to tell their own stories in their own words. What humanity truly lost in the destruction of the library was not just information. We lost answers to ancient mysteries that still puzzle us. We lost scientific insights that could have transformed our world much earlier. We lost technological blueprints for devices that might have reshaped history. We lost works of art and philosophy that could have deepened our understanding of human nature. We lost histories that would have given forgotten civilizations a voice. We lost knowledge that could have saved lives, eased suffering, and guided the choices of generations. The death of the library is, at its core, a human tragedy. It represents the loss of our collective memory and a vast portion of our shared potential. It is the erasure of futures that might have been. And it raises one final haunting question. Was this catastrophe truly unavoidable, or did humanity watch, passively or willingly, as its greatest treasure slipped away? After thousands of years of speculation, after combing through ancient testimonies, after decades of archaeological digs and years of modern scientific analysis, one truth stands above all others. No single event destroyed the Library of Alexandria. Julius Caesar's fire did not end it. Aurelian's siege did not end it. The fall of the Serapeum did not end it. The Islamic conquest certainly did not end it. Each of these episodes delivered a blow. Each chipped away a portion of what once existed. But the library's final destruction was not a dramatic moment in time. It was a process. Political violence, religious conflict, war, natural disasters, economic decline, neglect, human forgetfulness, and the relentless passage of time. All of these were the library's true enemies. Not one flame, but 1,000 tiny sparks. Not one collapse, but countless cracks. Not one villain, but a long series of decisions and failures that, together, extinguished knowledge one scroll at a time. Even after centuries of study, a deeper mystery lingers. How could humanity allow its greatest collection of knowledge to disappear? Because the library was never just a building. It was humanity's first true research institution, the ancient world's global archive, a symbol of intellectual unity and ambition. It was the first serious attempt to gather all human knowledge under one roof. Losing it meant losing a version of ourselves that believed knowledge could bind the world together. That belief died long before the last scroll decayed. Modern scholars from universities such as Harvard, Cambridge, Oxford, Alexandria University, the Sorbonne, Copenhagen, Stanford, and many others now agree on a final sobering conclusion. The library did not fall by accident. It fell because, across centuries, no one was willing or able to fully protect it. Power changed hands. Empires rose and fell. Ideologies clashed. Wars swept through the city. Earthquakes shook its foundations. Leaders turned their attention to other priorities. Each generation inherited a little less of the library than the one before, and invested a little less in keeping it alive. In the end, the library did not simply burn. It faded, piece by piece, scroll by scroll, shelf by shelf, decade by decade, until one day there was no longer a building to point to, no shelves to salvage, no librarians to remember the catalogue, and no living memory of its true scale. There was nothing left to burn, and almost nothing left to remember. Only a ghost, only a legend. This story forces us to confront another question. Could it happen again? Today, we have digital archives, global networks, redundant servers, and backups scattered across continents. It is easy to believe our knowledge is safe. But history whispers a warning. Knowledge is always fragile. One war, one ideology determined to control information, one political purge, one cascading economic collapse, one sufficiently large disaster. Any of these could shatter the systems we take for granted. The death of the Library of Alexandria is a warning from the past. If we do not actively protect knowledge, we will lose it, not necessarily in flames, but in silence. So what truly happened to the Library of Alexandria? The answer is both simple and profound. It was not destroyed in a single act. It was abandoned. It died the way civilizations die, not suddenly, but slowly, quietly, forgotten by the very people who had once depended on it. And perhaps that is why the library remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. Because somewhere beneath the waters off Alexandria, or buried deep under its modern streets, or scattered in fragments across forgotten deserts and archives, lie traces of the knowledge we once held. Pieces of lost texts, echoes of vanished ideas, remnants of a world that believed in the power of universal knowledge. They are waiting to be rediscovered, waiting to be remembered, waiting for someone to ask the question again. What really happened to the greatest library ever built? The search continues, and the mystery of the Library of Alexandria, the mystery of how we treat our own knowledge, will never die.